you order a light shirt,
yeah.
I'll put it in the bag for you, and then you'll be a part of history or something. And we just put all the shirt orders on the back.
Yeah, done.
Be a part of the official Guinness World Record. Order a shirt and something in the background of the attempt.
Do you want it on the YouTube chat? What else do you want it on?
Yeah, do it on the YouTube, and then you just like get them ready, and I'll just put them in the bag and just put it on the thing.
Yeah. What? Yes, you should do a 10-minute break.
Buy a shirt, and the Gulag Archipelago, and watch a history lesson on the USSR and allies. But I will also pack a shirt for you. You will become a part of history. Because you'll be in the last room. You'll probably do most people wear it. And I think it's very liberating.
Huh? Okay.
Thanks so much for jumping on. I understand I might have looked a bit cocky in that last one. So these people have ordered shirts. They're going to be in the background making history. So if you order a shirt, you're going to be in the background, and we'll send them all out express post. Once I get the Guinness World Record, keeps us all accountable. This is my favorite book of all time. The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was born in 1918 and grew up in Rostov-on-Don. He graduated in physics and mathematics from Rostov University and studied literature by correspondence course at Moscow University in World War II. He fought as an artillery officer, attaining the rank of captain in 1955. However, after making derogatory remarks about Stalin in a letter, he was arrested and summarily sentenced to 8 years in forced labor camps, followed by internal exile. In 1957, he was formally rehabilitated and settled down to teaching and writing in Ryazan and Moscow. The publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in November in 1962 was followed by the publication in the West of his novels Canterwood and The First Circle. In 1970, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in 1974, his citizenship was revoked and he was expelled from the Soviet Union. He eventually settled in Vermont, USA, and completed his great historical cycle, The Red Wheel, in 1990, with
the fall of the Soviet communism, his citizenship was restored, and 4 years later, he returned to settle in Russia. He died in 2008 near Moscow at the age of 89. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago, 1918 to 1956, an experiment in literary investigation. I dedicate this to all those who did not live to tell it, and may they please forgive me for not having seen it all, nor remembered it all, for not having divined all of it. Forward. Once we have taken up the word, it is therefore impossible to turn away. A writer is no detached judge of his countrymen and contemporaries. He is an accomplice to all the evil committed in his country or by his people. And if the tanks of his fatherland have bloodied the pavement of a foreign capital, then rust-coloured stains have forever bespattered the writer's face. And if on some fateful night a trusting friend is strangled in his sleep, then the palms of the writer bear the bruises from that rope. And if his youthful fellow citizens nonchalantly proclaim the advantages of debauchery over humble toil, if they abandon themselves to drugs or seize hostages, then this stench too is mingled with the breath of the writer. Have we the insolence to declare that we do not answer for the evils of today's world? The simple act of an ordinary brave man is not to participate in lies, not to support false actions. His rule, let that come into the world, let it even reign supreme, only not through me, but it is within the power of writers and artists to do much more, to defeat the lie. For in the struggle with lies, art has always triumphed and shall always triumph, visibly, irrefutably for all. Lies can prevail against much in this world, but never against art. One word of truth shall outweigh the entire world. From the speech delivered by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn to the Swedish Academy on the occasion of his acceptance of the Nobel Prize for Literature. First, you defend your homeland against the Nazis serving as a twice decorated soldier on the Eastern Front in the criminally ill-prepared Soviet Red Army. Then you're arrested, humiliated, stripped of your military rank, charged under the auspices of the all-purpose Article 58 with the dissemination of anti-Soviet propaganda, and dragged off to Moscow's infamous Lubyanka prison. There, through the bars of your cell, you watch your beloved country celebrating its victory in the Great Patriotic War. Then you're sentenced in absentia to 8 years of hard labor, but you got away easy. It wasn't so long afterward that people in your position were awarded a tenner and the quarter of a century. In fate, it isn't finished with you yet. Not by any means. You develop a deadly cancer in the camp, endure the exile imposed on you after your imprisonment ends, and pass very close to death. Despite all of this, you hold your head high, you refuse to turn against man or God, although you have every reason to do so. You write instead, secretly at night, documenting your terrible experiences, your craft of a personal memoir, a single day in the labor camp, and the miracle of miracles. The clouds part, the sun shines through, your book is published. And in your own country, it meets with unparalleled acclaim, nationally and internationally. But the sky darkens once again, and the sun disappears. The repression returns. You become once again a non-person. The secret police, the dread KGB, sees the manuscripts of your next book. It sees the light of day nonetheless, but only in the West. There your reputation grows beyond the wildest of imaginings. The Nobel Committee itself bestows upon you its highest literary honor. The Soviet authorities, stripped of their camouflage, are enraged. They order the secret police to police you. You pass, once again, near death, but you continue to write, driven, solitary, intolerably inspired. The Gulag Archipelago, documents the absolute and utter corruption of the dogmas and doctrine of your state, your empire, your leaders, and yourself. And then that is printed too, not in your own country, but in the West once again, from copies oh so dangerously hidden and smuggled across the borders, and your great book burst with unparalleled and dreadful force into the still naive and unexpected literary and intellectual world. You are expelled from the Soviet Union, stripped of your citizenship, forced to take residency in a society both strange to you and your resistant in its own way to your prophetic words, but the power of your stories and the strength of your morals demolish any remaining claims to ethical and philosophical credibility still made by the defenders of the collectivist systems that gave rise to all of that you have witnessed. Years pass, but not so many from the perspective of history. Then, another miracle. The Soviet Union collapses. You return home. Your citizenship is restored. You write and speak in your reclaimed homeland until death claimed you in 2008. A year later, the Gulag Archipelago is deemed mandatory reading by those responsible for establishing the national school curriculum. One of your home country, the impossible victory is complete. The 3 volumes of the Gulag Archipelago, one continuous extended stream of outrage, are paradoxically brilliant, better, disbelieving, and infused with awe, or at the strength characterizing the best among us in the world of all situations. In that monumental text, published in 1973, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn conducted an experiment in literary investigation, a hybrid of journalism, history, biography, unlike anything you've ever written before or since. In 1985, the author bestowed his approval upon Edward E. Erickson Jr.'s single-volume abridgment republished here. On the 15th anniversary of the completion of the full 3-volume edition and centenary of the author's birth, and sold some 30 million copies in 35 languages. Between the pages of Solzhenitsyn's book, apart from the documentation of the horrors of the legions of the dead, counted and uncounted, and the masses whose lives were torn asunder, are the insurmountable, soul-chilling personal stories, carefully preserved, making the tragedy of mass betrayal, torture and death, not the mere statistics Stalin so disdainfully described, but individual, real, and terrible. It is a matter of pure historical fact that the Gulag Archipelago played a primary role in bringing the Soviet Empire to its knees. Although economically unsustainable, ruled in the most corrupt manner imaginable, and reliant on the slavery and enforced deceit of its citizens, the Soviet system managed to stumble forward through far too many decades before being cut to the quick. The courageous leaders of the labor union in Poland, the great Pope John Paul II, and American President Ronald Reagan, with his blunt insistence that the West faced an evil empire, all played their role in its defeat and its collapse. It was Solzhenitsyn, however, whose revelations made it positively shameful to defend not just the Soviet state, but the very system of thought that made that state what it is today. It was Solzhenitsyn who was most crucially made the case of the terrible excesses of communism could not be conveniently blamed on the corruption of the Soviet leadership, the cult of personality surrounding Stalin, or the failure to put the otherwise stellar and admirable utopian principles of Marxism into proper practice. It was Solzhenitsyn who demonstrated the death of millions and the devastation of many more instead of direct causal consequence of the philosophy, worse perhaps the theology, driving the communist system. The hypothetically egalitarian universalist doctrines of Karl Marx contained hidden within them the sufficient hatred, resentment, envy, and denial of individual culpability and responsibility to produce nothing but poison and the death when manifested in the world. For Marx, A man was a member of a class, an economic class, a group. That and little more. And history nothing but the battleground of classes of groups. His admirers continued to regard Marx's doctrine as one of compassion, moral by definition, virtuous by fiat. Consider the working classes in all their oppression and work forthrightly to free them. But hate may well be stronger and more compelling, motivated than love. In consequence, it took no time in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution for solidarity with the common man and the apparently laudable demand for universal equality to manifest its unarticulated and ever-darkening shadow. First came the most brutal indictment of the class enemy. Then came the ever-expanding definition of that enemy until every single person in the entirety of the state found him or herself at risk of encapsulation within the insatiable and devouring net. The verdict delivered to those deemed at fault by those who elevated themselves to the simultaneous held positions of judge, jury, and executioner. The necessity to eradicate the victimizers, the oppressors, in toto, without any consideration whatsoever for reactionary niceties, such as individual innocence. Let us note as well, this outcome wasn't the result of the initially preceding Marxist doctrine becoming corrupt over time, but something apparent and present at the very beginning of the Soviet state itself. Solzhenitsyn cites, for example, one Martin Latzis writing for the newspaper Red Terror, November 1st, 1918. We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. It's not necessary during the interrogation to look for evidence proving that accused opposed the Soviets by word or action. The first question you should ask him is, what class does he belong to? What is his origin, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. Such is the sense and essence of Red Terror. It is necessary to think, when you read such a thing, to meditate long and hard on that message. It is necessary to recognize, for example, that the writer believed that it would be better to execute 10,000 potentially innocent individuals than to allow one poisonous member of the oppressor class to remain free. It is equally necessary to pose the question, who precisely belongs to the hypothetical entity, the bourgeoisie? It is not as if the boundaries of such category are self-evident. There are the mere perceiving. They must be drawn, but where exactly? And more importantly, by whom? Or by what? If it's hate inscribing the lines instead of love, they will inevitably be drawn so that the lowest, meanest, most cruel, and most useless of the conceptual geographers will be justified in manifesting the greatest possible evil and producing the greatest possible misery. Members of the bourgeoisie, beyond all redemption, they had to go as a matter of course. What of their wives, children, even their grandchildren? Off with their heads too. All were incorrigibly corrupt by their class identity, and their destruction, therefore, ethically necessitated. How convenient that the darkest and direst of all possible motivation could be granted the highest of moral standings. That was true marriage of hell and heaven. What values, what philosophical presumptions truly dominated under such circumstances? Was it dire for brotherhood, dignity, and freedom from want? Not in the least, not given the outcome. It was instead the obvious, the murderous rage of hundreds of thousands of biblical Cains, each looking to torture, destroy, and sacrifice their own private Abels. There is simply no other manner of accounting for the corpses. What can be concluded in the deepest, most permanent sense from Solzhenitsyn's anguished Gulag narrative? First, we learn what is indisputable, what we all should have learned by now, what we have nonetheless failed to learn, that the left, like the right, can go too far, that the left has in the past gone much too far. Second, we learn what is far more subtle and difficult, how and why the going too far occurs. We learn as Solzhenitsyn so profoundly insists that the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, And we learn as well that as we all are, each of us simultaneously oppressor and oppressed. Thus, we come to realize that the twin categories of guilty oppressor and justice-seeking victim can be made endlessly inclusive. This is not the least because we all benefit unfairly and we are equally victimized. By our thrownness, our arbitrary placement in the flow of time, we all accrue undeserved, somewhat random privilege from the vagaries of our place of birth. Our inequitable distributed talents, our ethnicity, race, culture, and sex. We all belong to a group, some group, that has been elevated in comparative status through no effort of our own. This is true in some manner, along some dimension, group category for every solitary individual except for the single most lowly of all. At some time and in some manner, we all may, in consequence, be justly targeted as oppressors, and may all equally seek justice or revenge as victims, even if the initiators of the revolution had, therefore, in their most pure moments, been driven by a holy desire to lift up the downtrodden. Was it not guaranteed that they would also be overtaken by these motivated primarily by envy, hate, and the desire to destroy as the revolution progressed? Hence, the establishment of the hungrily growing and most often fatal list of class enemies right from the very first moments of the communist revolution. The demolition was aimed first at the students, the religious believers, and the socialists, continuing under Stalin with the old revolutions themselves, and was followed soon thereafter by the annihilation of the successful peasant farmers' kulaks. And this appetite for destruction wasn't of the type to be satiated with the bodies of the perpetrators themselves. As Solzhenitsyn writes, they burned out whole areas, whole nests, whole families, as from the start, and they watched jealously to be sure that none of the children, 14, 10, even 6 years old, got away. To the last scrappings, all had to go down the same road to the same common destruction. This was driven by the perceived, even self-perceived guilt of all. How else is it possible for hundreds of thousands or perhaps even millions of informants, prosecutors, betrayers, and unforgivable mute observers to spring so rapidly into being the tumult of the Red Terror? Thus, the doctrine of group identity inevitably ends with everyone identified as a class enemy and oppressor, with everyone unclean and cleanly contaminated by bourgeois privilege, unfairly enjoying the benefits bequeathed by the vagaries of history, with everyone prosecuted without respite, and for the corruption and injustice, no mercy for the oppressor, and no punishment too severe for the crime of exploitation. Expiation becomes impossible because there is no individual guilt, no individual responsibility, and therefore no manner individual which crime of arbitrary birth can be individually accounted for, and all the misery that can be generated as a consequence of such. An accusation is the true reason for the accusation. When everyone is guilty, all that serves justice is the punishment of everyone. When the guilt extends to the existence of the world's misery itself, only then the fatal punishment will suffice. It is much more preferable instead, and much more likely to preserve us all from metastasizing hells, to state forthrightly, I am indeed thrown arbitrarily into history. I therefore choose to voluntarily shoulder the responsibility of my advantages and the burden of my disadvantages like every other individual. I am morally bound to pay for my advantages with my responsibility. I am morally bound to accept my disadvantages as the price I pay for being. I will therefore strive not to descend into bitterness and seek vengeance because I have less to my credit and a greater burden to stumble forward with than others. Is that not even the essential point of difference between the West, for all its faults, and the brutal, terrible egalitarian systems generated by the pathological communist doctrine? The great and good framers of the American public, were, for example, anything but utopian. They took full measure of ineradicable from the profoundly cautious common law tradition of England. They endeavoured to establish a system that corrupt and ignorant fools we all are could not damage too fatally. That's humility. That's clear-headed knowledge of the limitation of human machination and good intention. But the communists, the revolutionaries, they aimed grandly and admirably, at least in theory, at a much more heavenly vision, and they began their pursuit with the hypothetically straightforward and oh so morally justifiable enforcement of economic equality. Wealth, however, was not so easily generated. The poor could not simply become rich, but the riches of those who had anything more than the greatest pauper, no matter how pitiful that more was, that could be redistributed, or at least destroyed. That's equality too. That's sacrifice in the name of heaven and earth. And redistribution was not enough. With all its theft, betrayal, and death, mere economic engineering was insufficient. What emerged as well was the overarching and truly totalitarian desire to remake man and women, as such the longing to restructure the human spirit in the very image of communist preconceptions, attributing to themselves the divine ability, the transcendent wisdom, and with unshakable belief in the glowing but ever-receding future, that newly minted Soviet tortured thieves imprisoned, lied, and betrayed, all the while masking their great evil with virtue. It was Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, that tore the mask off and exposed the feral cowardice, envy, deceit, resentment, and hatred for the individual and for existence itself that pulsed beneath. Others had made the attempt. Malcolm Margaridge reported on the horror of dekulakization, the forced collectivization that all too recently successfully peasantry of the Ukraine and elsewhere that preceded the horrifying famines of the 1930s. In the same decade, in the same following years, George Orwell risked his ideological commitments and his reputation to tell us all what was already truly occurring in the Soviet Union in the name of egalitarianism and brotherhood. But it was Solzhenitsyn who truly shamed the radical left's face, forcing them underground, where they have festered and plotted for the last 40 years, failing unforgivably to have learned what all reasonable people should have learned from the cataclysm of the 20th century and its egalitarian utopianism. And today, despite everything, and under their sway, almost 3 decades since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the apparent collapse of communism, we are doing everything we can to forget Solzhenitsyn, so clearly demonstrated to our great and richly deserved peril. Why don't all our children read the Gulag Archipelago in our high schools as they now do in Russia? Why don't our teachers feel compelled to read the book aloud? Did we not win the Cold War? Were the bodies not piled high enough? How high would be then? Why, for example, is it still acceptable and in polite company to profess the philosophy of a communist, or if not, at least admire the work of Marx? Why is it still acceptable to regard the Marxist doctrine as essentially accurate in its diagnosis of the hypothetical evils of the free market? Democratic West is still considered that doctrine progressive and fit for the compassionate and proper thinking person. 25 million people dead through internal repression in the Soviet Union, according to the Black Book of Communism, 60 million dead in Mao's China, and all too likely return to autocratic oppression in the country in the near future. The horrors of Cambodia killing fields with the near 2 million corpses, the barely animate body politic of Cuba, when people struggled even now to feed themselves, Venezuela, where it has now been made illegal to attribute a child's death in hospital to starvation. No political experiment has ever been tried so wildly with so many desperate people in need, so many different countries with such different histories, and failed so absolutely and so catastrophically. It is mere ignorance, albeit the most inexcusable kind, that allows today Marxists to flaunt their continued allegiance to present it as a compassionate and a care. Or is it instead envy of the successful in near infinite proportions of, or something akin to hatred for mankind itself? How much proof do you need? Why do we still avert our eyes from the truth? Perhaps we simply lack sophistication. Maybe, perhaps we just can't understand. Perhaps our tendency towards compassion is so powerfully necessary in the intimacy of our family and friendships that we cannot contemplate its limitation, its inability to scale, its propensity to mutate into hatred of the oppressor rather than allegiance with the oppressed. Perhaps we cannot comprehend the limitations and dangers of the utopian vision given our definite need to contemplate and to strive for a better tomorrow. We certainly don't seem to imagine, for example, that the hypothesis of some state of future perfection, for example, the truly egalitarian and permanent brotherhood of man, can be used to justify any and all sacrifices whatsoever, the pristine and heavenly end, making all conceivable means not only acceptable but morally required. There is simply no price too great to pay in pursuit of the ultimate utopia. This is particularly true if it is someone else's who foots the bill, and it is clearly the case that we require a future towards which to orient ourselves to provide meaning in our life. Psychologically speaking, it is for that reason we see the same need expressed collectively a much larger scale in the Judeo-Christian vision and the promised land and the kingdom of heaven and earth. And it is also clearly the case that sacrifice is necessary to bring that desired end state into being. That's the discovery of the future itself. The necessary forego instantaneous gratification in the present to delay to bargain with fate so that the future can be better, twinned with necessity to let go, to burn off, to separate wheat from chaff, and to sacrifice what is presently unworthy so that tomorrow can be better than today. But limits need to be placed around who or what is deemed dispensable, and it is exactly the necessity for interminable sacrifice that constitutes the terrible counterpart of the utopian vision. Heaven is worth any price, but who pays? Christianity solved that problem by insisting on the sacrifice of the self, insisting that the suffering and malevolence of the world is the responsibility of each individual, insisting that each of us sacrifice what is unworthy and unnecessary and resentful and deadly in our character, despite the pain of such sacrifice, so that we could stumble properly uphill under our respective and voluntarily shouldered existential burdens. But it was and is the opinion of the materialist utopian that someone else be sacrificed, so that heaven itself might be attained. Some perpetrator or victimizer or oppressor or member of a privileged group, a cynic, might be forgiven in consequence for asking, it is the city of God that is in fact the aim, or is the true aim the desire to make a burning sacrificial pyre of everyone and everything, and the hypothesis of the coming brotherhood of man merely the cover story of the camouflage? Perhaps it is precisely the horror that is the point, and not the utopia. It is far from obvious in such situations just what is horse and what is cart. It is precisely in the aftermath of the death of 100 million people or more that such dark questions must be asked. And we should also note that the utopian vision, dressed as it is inevitably in compassion, is a temptation particularly difficult to resist, and may therefore offer a particularly subtle and insidious justification for mayhem. Here's some thoughts. No, some facts. Every social system produced inequality at present, and every social system has done so since the beginning of the time. The poor have been with us and will be with us always. Analysis of the content of the individual Paleolithic grave sites provides evidence for the existence of substantive variance in the distribution of ability, privilege, and wealth, even in our distant past. The more illustrious of our ancestries were buried with the great possessions hoards of the precious metal, weapons, jewelry, and costuming. The majority, however, struggled through their lives and were buried with nothing. Inequality is the iron rule, even among animals, with their intense competition for quality living space and reproductive opportunity, even among plants and cities, even among the stellar lights that dot the cosmos themselves, were a minority of privileged and oppressive heavenly bodies contained the mass of thousands of millions or even billions of average dispossessed planets. Inequality is the deepest of problems built into the structure of reality itself. and it will not be solved by the presumptuous ideology-inspired retooling or the rare, free, stable, and productive democracies of the world, the only system that have provided some modicum of wealth along with the inevitability in inequality and its attendant suffering are those that evolved in the West, with their root in Judeo-Christian tradition, precisely the systems that emphasize above all else essential dignity, divinity, and ultimate responsibility of the individual, and consequence any attempt to attribute the existence of inequality to the functioning of the productive institutions we have managed to create and protect will so recently in what is still accurately regarded as a free world will hurt those who are the weakest and the most vulnerable first. The claims they make to act under this inspiration of pure compassion must therefore come to be regarded with the deepest suspicion, not least by those who dare to make such claims themselves. The dangers of the utopian vision have been laid bare, even if the reason those dangers exist have not yet been fully and acceptably articulated. If there was any excuse to be a Marxist in 1917, and both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche prophesied well before then that there would be hell to pay for the doctrine, there is absolutely and finally no excuse now. And we know that most because of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago. Thank heaven for the great author's outrage, courage, and unquenchable thirst for justice of the truth. It was Solzhenitsyn who warned us that the catastrophes of the Soviet state were so inextricably and causally linked to the deceitful blandishments of the Marxist utopian vision. It was Solzhenitsyn who carefully documented the price paid in suffering for the dreadful communist experiment, and who distilled from that suffering the wisdom we must all heed, so that catastrophe does not visit us again. Perhaps we could make from his writing the humility that would allow us to understand that our mere good intentions are not sufficient to make us good men and women. Perhaps we could come to understand of our unpardonable historical ignorance, our utterly willful blindness, and our voracious hidden appetite for vengeance, terror, and destruction. Perhaps we could come to remember and to learn from the intolerable trials endured by all those who passed through the fiery chambers of the Marxist collectivist ideology. Perhaps we could derive from that remembering and learning that the wisdom necessary to take personal responsibility for the suffering and malevolence that still so terribly and unforgivably characterizes the world. We have been provided with the means to transform ourselves in due humility by the literary and moral genius of the great Russian author. We should all pray most devoutly to whatever deity guides us implicitly or explicitly for the desire and the will to learn from what we have been offered. May God himself eternally fail to forgive us if in the painstakingly reveled aftermath of such bloodshed, torture, and gish we remain stiff-necked, incautious, and unchanged. Jordan B. Peterson, 2018. Foreword to the abridgment. If it were possible for any nation to fathom another people's bitter experience through a book, how much easier its future fate would become, and how many calamities would end mistakes if could avoid. But if it is very difficult, there always is the fallacious belief it would not be the same here. Such things are impossible. Alas, all the evil of the 20th century is possible everywhere on earth. Yet I have not given up all hope that humanity, beings, and nations may be able, in spite of all, to learn from the experience of other people without having to live through it personally. Therefore, I gratefully accepted Professor Erickson's suggestion to create a 1-volume abridgment of the 3-volume work, The Gulag Archipelago, in order to facilitate its reading for those who do not have much time in this hectic century of ours. I thank Professor Erikson for his generous initiative, as well as for the tactfulness and the literary taste and the understanding of Western readers which he displayed during the work on the abridgment. In 1994, after 20 years of forced exile in the West, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn returned to Russia. At one town meeting held on the Trans-Siberian Whistle Stop tour, reacquainted himself with the homeland he was once confronted by this rebuke. It is you and your writing that started it all, that brought our country to the verge of collapse and devastation. Russia doesn't need you, so go back to your blessed America. Solzhenitsyn instantly replied that to his dying day, he would keep fighting against the evil ideology that was capable of slaying 1/3 of his country's population. The meeting erupted in applause. That sort of exchange was unimaginable. When the present abridgment of the Gulag Archipelago first appeared in 1995, almost no one expected then that within a few years the Soviet Union would collapse. And almost in a day, like the legendary one-horse show, yet now the dramatic events that put the closing back punctuation mark on the Soviet parenthesis in Russian history have also, we may say, brought to an end to what the great Russian poet Anna Akhmatova called the true 20th century. This first foreshortened century, running from 1914 to 1970 to 1989 to 1991, was the era when utopian dreams rooted in Enlightenment optimism came to rely on brute force to make ideological schemes prevail. The 20th century has proven in quantitative terms at least the most murderous in human history, as governments killed their subjects around record rates. For decades, the word Holocaust served as shorthand for modern man, inhuman to man, then one ion. Men added a second such term, Gulag, which now operates in dictationaries as a common room. Solzhenitsyn was one of the precious few who did anticipate the demise of the social experiment, and he thought his book would help. Oh yes, the Gulag was destined to affect the course of history. I was sure of that. Forced into exile, and precisely because Gulag had appeared in the West, he mused, you Bolsheviks are finished there, and no two ways about it. What satisfaction he felt when some early reviews, such as one of Frankfurter's Allgemeine, a leading German newspaper, caught his intentions. The time may come where we date the beginning of the American collapse to the Soviet system from the appearance, the Gulag. American diplomat and scholar George F. Kennan hailed the Gulag, hailed the work as the greatest and most powerful single indictment of the work as the greatest and most powerful single indictment of a political regime ever to be leveled in modern times. One sure to stick the claw of the Soviet propaganda machine with increasing discomfort until it has done its work. Solzhenitsyn had proven prescient no other matters as well. Not only did he reiterate in the teeth of the prevailing opinion of Western specialists on Soviet affairs that he was absolutely convinced that communism will go. He also insisted that most resolutely and against all seeming reason that he expected to be reunited with his beloved Russia. In a strange way, I not only hope that I am inwardly convinced, and I shall go back to mean physical return, not just my I mean my physical return and not just my books, and that contradicts all rationality. His improbable prerequisites were that his citizenship be restored, that the charge of treason against him be dropped, and that all the comments, his books be published in his homeland after his prophecies were fulfilled. A friend of his reminisced, it seemed crazy to me at the time, but it was a real conviction. Poet's knowledge, he sees the man sees. However, historians ultimately apportion the credit for ending the Cold War. Solzhenitsyn indubitably played a part in bringing the Soviet edifice down to support his writings. Delegitimized communism in his homeland and discredited abroad. He was much too modest in depicting himself in a little car foolishly budding a mighty oak and thinking this could bring it down. As David Remnick, editor of the New York, declares, in terms of the effect he has had on history, Solzhenitsyn is the dominant writer of this century. Who else compares? Orwell, Kostler? Remnick concluded that to some extent you have to credit the literary works of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn with help in bringing down the last empire on earth. It might be supposed that if Solzhenitsyn won his argument with history, or even precisely because he did win, his relevance is now over. But that would be to presuppose that we have successfully come to terms with the 20th century and have learned its lesson. Unfortunately, if understandably, civilized society after the brief euphoria of 1989 and 1991 has generally averted its gaze from the dreadful record. As one former denizen of the Gulag, Lev Razganov, put it, people are tired of the past. A review of Solzhenitsyn's record will highlight the historical impact of two of his books. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich appeared in 1962. The world's attention was drawn to the cruelty of the Soviet Gulag. At a stroke, a hitherto unknown high school teacher and mathematics and physics was catapulted into newspaper headlines around the globe. In retrospect, that novella can be seen as the first crack in the Berlin Wall. From the platform of fame, the author could launch the Gulag Archipelago, and it now stands as the indispensable text revealing the distinctive character of the age. Through Herculean research efforts into Soviet atrocities, Solzhenitsyn has sketched the panorama and provided many details. Other witnesses and scholars have answered his call to fill in the blank spots in the picture, and the literature of the Gulag continues to be written. The recently published Black Book of Communism, with its global analysis of communism's crime and repressions, has put a frame around the unfinished picture, the black border, to be sure. Among the gaping blank spots that remain, we have yet to determine roughly how many politically induced deaths the Soviet regime inflicted. Solzhenitsyn publicized a demographer's estimate for some 60 million. Alexander Yakovlov, a high official in the Babchev regime and now chairman of the Russian Commission for the Rehabilitation of the Victims of Political Repression, estimates numbers at perhaps 35 million. Also, he admits that his generation allowed those monsters, Lenin and Stalin, to us, and that it is high time for him and others to repent, to apologize to those it is survived, and to kneel before the millions who were shot. Yakovlov's penitential posture accords with Solzhenitsyn's moral vision. A key passage in Gulag proclaims, so let the reader who expects this book to be a political expose Slam its covers shut right now. The passage proceeds to specify that moral matters are fundamental because it's the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Given that the nature of experiment, the political dimension of life is never far from Solzhenitsyn's mind, but he always approaches political and moral terms. Anyone then who views human reality primarily through the prism of politics will misread the Gulag Archipelago. To understand the government power can perpetrate all sorts of atrocities upon human beings, body and soul, but it can never fully succeed in quenching the human spirit. Yes, some people will submit and will die spiritually, but others, like Ivan Denisovich, will endure and prevail. Despite of the indignities inflicted upon them, their innate human dignities will remain intact. In this sense, totalitarianism must always fail. In Solzhenitsyn's case, a moral vision grows organically from a religion commitment. Passages in the Gulag describe his move from the heart of Marx to Christ during his years of incarceration. A change of heart amplified in subsequent writings because religious faith in his bedrock conviction, the greatest impediment to appreciating and appropriating Solzhenitsyn has been the era of listening to his sad music of Russia with ears attuned solely to secular wavelengths. Many Western admirers who in the early years of Solzhenitsyn fame had lionized him as an anti-totalitarian freedom fighter reacted with shock and dismay when in 1972 he publicized his Christian faith, static interfering with his Western reception increased when the now exiled writer and speaker of Western audiences above the intellectuals and journalists developed a negative consensus about him, which was memorably captured by American critic Jerry Leiber complaint in 1974. He is not the liberal that we would like him to be. That consensus hardened over the following 2 decades. By the 1990s, the Western response to Solzhenitsyn could be called schizophrenic. On the one hand, the misrepresentations encased within the negative consensus caused David Remnick to lament that when Solzhenitsyn's name comes up now, it is more often than not as a freak, a monarchist, an anti-Semite, a crank, a has-been, not as a hero. On the other hand, Solzhenitsyn was widely reported to be the most admired living Russian by the Western press that couldn't quite fathom why. Now that the abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago returns to print, the 25 to 30% of it that survived my knife readers can form their judgments afresh. The usual reaction to any of abridgment is that it is bad business, almost just desecration. Yet here it is a book, and that has been translated into 35 languages and sold more than 30 million copies, nearly 3 million in the United States alone. And nonetheless remains more known about than now. One of the many occasions when I have lectured in Solzhenitsyn, members of the audience have told me that they have read the first 100 or so pages of the volume 1, but never, despite good intentions, return to read the rest. We can identify 3 obstacles that deflect readers. First, work is very long, more than 1,800 pages. Second, some part depends upon more knowledge of Russian and Soviet history than all but a few Western readers have. Third, the many accumulated horror stories engender a sense of depression that overwhelms all but the most persevering readers. Therefore, my work of abridgment has been officially governed by several specifically principles and procedures. First and foremost, I have kept in mind a Western readership, one of the only limited knowledge of Russian history. Of course, it is impossible to take the Russianness out of this book, and I would not want to do so. If I could, the work is, after all, written by a Russian and primarily for Russians, but the sections that highlight universal moral values preponderate in the volume. Second, I have retained the 7-part structure of the original, which actually can be perceived more clearly in a 1-volume abridgment than in its 3-volume entirety. I have sought to provide a sense of the whole work and its developing argument, not merely a series of disconnected excerpts. Where the stitching is obvious, I have resorted to the semi-apology, inserting ellipsis points. For the most part, I hope that without consulting the original, it is not apparent where the stitching occurred. Chapters that have been deleted entirely are summarized in a sentence or two. The same is true for a few touches which are cut so deeply the sense of them cannot be gleaned from the remaining passages at Solzhenitsyn's own passage. I have eliminated much of his personal story through parts of it I treasure too much to drop. In sum, I have striven for maximum readability. This abridged text is designed for the general reader, not for the scholar. The full text, including footnotes and explanatory glosses, remains available for all those who wish to consult it. Surprisingly, the abridgment contains several short passages that have still not appeared in translation of the work of a whole, though they do appear in the author's collected work in Russian. We now know the fascinating story of how Solzhenitsyn compared the Gulag Archipelago on the run, and largely while at his hiding place in Estonia from invisible allies, his tribute to his co-workers in the literary underground. This material will eventually appear in its proper place as part of an augmented edition of his autobiographical work, The Oak and the Calf, just as he lightened that work by holding parts, so that he initially withheld parts of the Gulag. Such was the nature of the clandestine literature of the Soviet Gulag. This one obstacle that an abridgment should not try too hard to resolve. Cumulative effects of unrelieved horror. Solzhenitsyn knows what he is up against. Does it seem, he asks, at various times that I am repeating myself? Is it that the Gulag, he explains, that keeps repeating itself? Anyone who stays the course, however, will discover that no, that the final note of this work, as virtually all of his works, is the note of hope. So, if even the abridged version is too long for some reasons, that they should skip ahead in such chapters such as the Ascent and the 40 Days of Kangir to discover why Solzhenitsyn is hopeful. There, they will discover why, despite the common misimpression him as a Jeremiah figure, he considers himself an unshakable optimist. As he wrote to me in the letter advice about my work of abridging, the main goal, the main sense of the archipelago, is moral uplifting and catharsis. I must add that the author gave me considerably more help on this project than I ever could have hoped for. I deeply appreciate his many personal kindness. Any errors of omission or commission are mine alone. Solzhenitsyn once told me he thought in the abridged of the Gulag Archipelago, perhaps one who has been so right so often about so much, he will turn out to be right about this hope too. In 1949, some friends of mine and I came upon noteworthy news in Nature, a magazine of the Academy of Sciences. It reported in any time that in the case of excavations of the Kolyma River, a subterranean Iceland had been discovered, which was actually a frozen stream, and in it were found frozen specimens of prehistoric fauna. some 10 of thousands of year old, whether fish or salamander. These were preserved in so fresh a state, the scientific correspondents reported that those present immediately broke open the ice, encasing the specimen, and devoured them without relish on the spot. The magazine no doubt astonished its small audience with this news of how successfully the flesh of fish could be kept for fresh in a frozen state, but few indeed among its readers were able to decipher the genuine and heroic meaning of this incautious report. As for us, however, we understood it instantly. We could picture the entire scene right down to the smallest details, how those present broke up the ice in a frenzied haste, how flouting the higher claims of ichthyology and elbowing each other to be first as they tore off the chunks of the prehistoric flesh and hauled them over the bonfire to thaw them out and bolt them down. We understood because we ourselves were the same kind of people as those present at that event. We too were from that powerful tribe of Zeks, unique on the face of the earth, the only people who could devour prehistoric salamander with relish. And the Kolyma was the greatest and most famous island, the pole of ferocity of that amazing country of Gulag, which, scattered in an archipelago geographically, was in the psychological sense fused into continent and almost invisible, almost imperceptible country inhabited by the Zeks, and this with archipelago crisscrossed and patterned that other country within which it was located like a gigantic patchwork, cutting into the cities, however its streets, yet there were many who did not even guess at its presence, and many, many others who heard something vague, and only those who had been there knew the whole truth. But as those stricken dumb on the islands of the archipelago, they kept their silence. By an unexpected turn of our history, a bit of the truth, an insignificant part, but of the whole, was allowed to open. But those same hands, which once grew tight, our handcuffs, now hold out their palm in consolation. No, don't dig up the past. Dwell on the past and you'll lose an eye. But the proverb goes on to say, forget the past and you'll lose both eyes. Decades go by and scores and scores of the past are healing over in the course of this period of the island of the archipelago has shuddered and dissolved, and the polar sea of oblivion rolls over them, and someday, in the future, this archipelago, its air, and the bones of its inhabitants, frozen in the lens of ice, will be discovered by our descendants like some improbable salamander. I would not be so bold as to try and write the history of the archipelago. I have never had the chance to read the documents, and in fact, will anyone ever have the chance to read them? Those who do not wish to recall have already had enough time, and will have more, to destroy all the documents down to the very last one. I have absorbed into myself my own 11 years that were not as something as shameful nor as a nightmare to be cursed. I have come almost to love that monstrous world, and now, by a happy turn of events, I have also been entrusted with many recent reports and letters, so perhaps I shall be able to give some account of the bones and the flesh of that salamander, of which, incidentally, is still very much alive. In this book, there are no fictitious persons nor fictitious events. People and places and names with their own names, if they are identified by initials instead of names, it is for personal considerations. If they are not named at all, it is only because human memory has failed to preserve the names, but it is all who took place just as it is here described. The book could never have been described by one person alone. In addition to what I myself was able to take away from the archipelago on the skin of my back and with my eyes, my ears, material for this book was given to me in reports, memoirs, and letters by 227 witnesses, whose names were to have been listed here. What I here express to them is not personal gratitude, but this is our common collective monument to all those who were murdered and tortured. From among them, I would like to single out in particular those who worked hard to help me obtain supporting bibliographical data from books to be found in contemporary libraries or from books long since removed from libraries and destroyed. Great persistence was often required to find even one copy which had been preserved. Even more, would I like to pay tribute to those who helped me keep the manuscript concealed in difficult periods and then have it copied. But the time has not yet come when I dare name them. The old Solovetsky Islands, prisoner of Dmitry Petrov's Vitsakovsky, was to have been editor in this book, but this half-life time span here, there, was to have been indeed his home camp memoirs, are entitled Half a Lifetime, resulted in untimely paralysis, and it was not until after he had already been deprived of the gift of speech that he was able to read several completed chapters only and see for himself that everything will be told. And if freedom still does not dawn on my country for a long time to come, then the very reading and handling of this book will be very dangerous, so that I am bound to salute future readers as well, on behalf of those who have perished. When I began to write this book in 1958, I knew of no memoirs nor works of literature dealing with the camps. During my years of work before 1967, I gradually became acquainted with the Kolyma stories of Valim Shalamov and the memoirs of Dmitry Vitikovsky, Y. Ginsberg, and O. Adamova Slizerberg, and to which I refer in course my narrative as literary facts known to all, as indeed some day shall be, despite their intent and against their will. Certain persons provided invaluable material for this book and helped preserve important facts and statistics as well as the very air they breathed. M.I. Sudrabs-Latsis, N.V. Krylenko, Chief State Prosecutor for many years, his heir, A.Y. Vyshinsky, and those jurists who were his accomplices, among whom one must single out in particular I.L. Avaberka. Material for this book was also provided by 36 Soviet writers headed by Maxim Gorky, authors of the disgraceful book on the White Sea Canal, which was the first in Russian literature to glorify slave labor. Solzhenitsyn was finally able to name his invaluable secret helper papers, The Invisible Allies, Trans Alex Kilimov and Michael Nicholson, Washington, Counterpart, 1995. Then in 2007, the author published for the first time the complete list of witnesses of the archipelago. Those of them who appear in this abridgment can be found incorporated into the name and place index at the end of the present volume. Editor's note: the Gulag Archipelago, Part 1. The prison industry. Chapter 1. Arrest. How do people get to this clandestine archipelago? Hour by hour, planes fly there, ships steer there, course there, and trains thunder off to it, but all with nary a mark on them. So tell their destination, and at ticket windows or at travel bureaus for Soviet or foreign tourists, the employees would be astounded if you were to ask for a ticket to go there. They know nothing. They've never heard of the archipelago as a whole or any one of its insurmountable islands. Those who go to the archipelago to administer it get there via training schools of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Those who go there to be guards are conscripted via military conscription centers, and those who, like you and me, dear reader, go there to die, must get there solely and compulsory via arrest. Arrest, need it be said, that is a breaking point in your life, a bolt of lightning which has scored a direct hit on you. That is an unassimilable spiritual earthquake. Not every person can cope with the result of which people often slip into insanity. The universe has as many different centers as there are living beings in it. Each of us is the center of the universe, and that universe is shattered when they hiss at you. You are under arrest. If you are arrested, can anything else remain unshattered by this cataclysm? But the darkened mind is incapable of embracing these displacements in our universe, and both of the most sophisticated and the very simpleton among us, drawing on all of our life experience, can gasp out only, me, for what? And this is a question which, though repeated millions and millions of times before, is yet to receive an answer. Arrest is an instantaneous, shattering thrust expulsion, somersault from one state into another. We have been happily born, or perhaps have unhappily dragged our weary way down the long and crooked streets of our lives, past all kinds of walls and fences made of rotting wood, rammed earth, brick, concrete, iron railings. We've never even given a thought to what lies behind them. We have never tried to penetrate them with our vision or our understanding, but there is where the Gulag country begins, right next to us, 2 yards away from us. In addition, we have failed to notice an enormous number of all closely fitted, well-disguised doors and gates in those fences. All those gates were prepared for us, every last one, and all of a sudden the fateful gate swings quickly open, and 4 white male hands, unaccustomed to physical labor but nonetheless strong and tenacious, grab us by the leg, arm, collar, cap, ear, and drag us like a sack, and the gate behind us, the gate to our past life, is slammed shut once and for all. That's all there is to it. You are arrested, and you'll find nothing better to respond with than the lamb-bike bleat, "Me? What for?" That's what arrest is. It's a blinding flash and a blow which shifts the present instantly into the past and the impossible into the omnipotent actuality. That is all. And neither for the first hour nor the first day will you be able to grasp anything else, except that, in your desperation, the fake circus moon will blink at you. It's a mistake. I'll set things right, and everything which is by now compromised in the traditional, even literary image of an arrest will pile up and take shape, not in your own apartment, remember. The sharp nighttime ring, the rude knock at the door, the insolent entrance of the unwiped jackboots of the unsleeped state secretary operatives, the frightened and cowed civilian witness at the back. And what function does the civilian witness serve? The victim doesn't even dare think about it, and the operatives don't remember. But that's what the regulations call for, and so he has to sit there all night long and sign in the morning. For the witness jerked from his bed, it is torture too, to go out at night after night to help arrest his own neighbors and acquaintances. The traditional image of an arrest is almost trembling hands packing for the victim a change of underwear, a piece of soap, something to eat. No one knows what is needed, what is permitted, what clothes best to wear. What do the security agents keep interrupting and hurrying you? You don't know anything. They'll feed you there. It's warm there. It's all lies. They keep hurrying you to frighten you. The traditional image of an arrest is also what happens afterward. When the poor victim has been taken away, it is an alien, brutal, and crushing force totally dominated the apartment for hours on end, breaking, ripping open everything, pulling from the walls, emptying things from wardrobes and desks onto the floor, shaking, dumping out, and ripping apart piling up mountains of jitter on the floor and the crunch of things being trampled beneath jackboots, and the nothing is sacred in a surge. During the arrest of the locomotive engineer in Ocean, a tiny coffin stood in his room containing the post body of his newly dead child. The jurors dumped the child body out of the coffin and searched it. They shake sick people out of their sick beds and they unwind bandages for the search beneath them. For those left behind after the arrest, there is nothing long tail end of a record end of vast, devastated life and the attempts to go in or deliver food parcels. But from all the windows, the answers come in, barking voices. Nobody here by that name. Never heard of him. Yes, and in the worst days in Leningrad, it took 5 days of standing in crowded lines just to get to that window, and it may be only after half a year or a year that the arrested person responds at all, or else the answer is tossed out, deprived of the right to correspond, and that means once and certain and for all, no right to correspondence, and that almost for certain means has been shot. That's how we picture arrest to ourselves. The kind of night arrest described is in fact a favorite because it has important advantages. Everyone living in the apartment is thrown into the state of terror by the first knock at the door. The arrested person is torn from the warmth of the bed. He is in a daze, half asleep, helpless, and his judgment is befogged. In a night arrest, the state security men have a superiority in numbers. There are many of them armed against one person who hasn't even finished buttoning his blouses. During the arrests and the search, it is highly improbable that a crowd of potential supporters will gather at the entrance, that unhurried step-by-step visits, first to the one apartment, then to another tomorrow, to a third and a fourth, provide an opportunity for security operations personnel to be deployed with a maximum efficiency and to imprison many more citizens of a given town than the police force itself in numbers. In addition, there is an advantage to night arrests in that neither the people in neighbouring apartment or houses nor those in the city streets can see how many have been taken away. Arrests which frighten the closest neighbourhood, there are no event at all to those farthest away. It's as if they had not taken place. Along the same asphalt ribbon on which the black Marias scurry at night, a tribe of youngsters strides by day with banners, flowers, and gay untroubled songs. But those take whose work consists solely of arrests, for whom the horror is boringly repetitive, have a much broader understanding of how arrests operate. They operate accordingly to a large body of theory, and innocence must not lead one to ignore this. The science of arrest is an important segment of the course on general penology and has been propped up with substantial body of social theory. Arrests are classified according to various criteria: nighttime and daytime, at home, at work, during a journey, first time arrest, and repeats, individual and group arrests. Arrests are distinguished by the degree of the surprise required, the amount of resistance expected, and even though in tens of millions of cases no resistance was expected and in fact there were none, arrests are also differentiated by the thoroughness of the required search and instruction either to make out or not to make out an inventory of confiscated property, or seal a room or apartment, to arrest the wife after the husband and send the children into an orphanage, or to send the rest of the family into exile, or to send the old folks into a labor camp too. No. Arrests vary wildly in form. In 1926, Irma Mendel, a Hungarian, obtained through a Camelleri 2 front row tickets, and she invited him to go with her. They sat through the show very affectionately, and when it was over, he took her straight to the Lubyanka. And if on flowering day in June in 1927, Kuznetsky was the plump-cheeked, red-headed beauty Anna Skripnikova, who had just bought some navy blue material for dress, climbed onto a hansom cab with a young man about town, you can be sure it wasn't a lover's tryst at all, as the cabman understood very well and showed by his frown. He knew the organs don't pay. It was an arrest. In just a moment, they would turn on the Lubyanka and enter the black moor of the gates. No one certainly cannot say that the daylight arrest during a journey, on a rest, or in the middle of a crowd has ever been neglected in our country. However, it has always been clean-cut, and most surprisingly of all, the victims, in cooperation with security men, have conducted themselves in the noblest conceivable manner so as to spare the living from witnessing the death of the condemned. Not everyone can be arrested at home with a preliminary knock at the door, and if there is a knock, then it has to be the house manager or else the postman, and not everyone can be arrested at work either. If the person to be arrested is vicious, then it's better to seize him outside his ordinary milieu, away from his family and colleagues. From there he show his views from any hiding places. It is essential that he have no chance to destroy, hide, or pass on anything to anyone. VIPs in the military or the party were sometimes first given new assignments, ensconced in the private railway car, and then arrested en route. Some obscure, ordinary mortal scared to death by epidemic arrests all around him and already depressed for a week by sinister glances by his chief, is suddenly summoned by the local party committee, where there he is beamingly presented with a vacation ticket to a Sochi sanitarium. The rabbit is overwhelmed. And immediately concludes that his fears were groundless. After expressing his gratitude, he hurries home, triumphantly to pack his suitcase. It is only 2 hours till the train time. He scolds his wife for being slow. He arrives at the station with time to spare, and there he is in the waiting room, at the bar. He's hailed by an extraordinary, pleasant young man. "Don't you remember me, Pyotr Ivanitch?" Pyotr Ivanitch has difficulty remembering. Well, not exactly, you see, although the young man, however, is overflowing with friend's concern. "Come now, you can't that be? I'll have to remind you." And he bows respectfully to Pyotr Ivanitch's wife. "You must forgive us. I'll keep him only 1 minute." The wife accedes, and trustingly the husband lets himself be led away by the arm. Forever, for 10 years, the station is thronged, and no one notices anything. Oh, you citizen, you who love to travel, do not forget that in every station there is a GPU branch of several prison cells. The importance of alleged acquaintances is so abrupt that a person who has not had the wolfish preparation of camp life is like to pull back from it. Do not suppose, for example, that if you are an employee of the American Embassy by the name of Aleksandr Dolgin, you cannot be arrested in broad daylight in Gorky Street, right by the central telegraph pole. Your unfamiliar friend dashes through the press of the crowd and opens his plundering arms to embrace you. "Sasha!" he simply shouts to you, with no effort to be inconspicuous. "Hey pal, long time no see. Come on over, let's get out of the way." At that moment, Pavidia Sedan draws up to the curb, and several days later, Taz will issue an angry statement to all the papers alleging that informed circles of the Soviet government have no information on the disappearance of Aleksandr Dolgin. But what's so unusual about that? Our boys have had carried out such arrests in Brussels, which was where Zora Blednov was seized, not just in Moscow. One has to give the organs their due. In an age when public speeches, the plays in our theatres, and women's fashion all seems to have come off assembly lines, arrests can be of the most varied kind. They take you aside in a factory corridor after you have had your passport checked and you're arrested. They take you from a military hospital with your temperature of 102, as they did with Ernst Bernstein, and the doctor will not rise a peep about your arrest. Just let him try. They'll take you right off the operating table, as they took Anna Vorobyov, a school inspector, in 1936, in the middle of an operation for a stomach ulcer, and drag you off to a cell, as they did him, half alive and bloody, as Carpenter collects in the gastronome, the fancy food store. You are invited to the special order department and arrested there. You are arrested for a religious pilgrim whom you have put up for the night. For the sake of Christ, you are arrested by a meter man who has come to read you an electric meter. You are arrested by a bicyclist who has run into you on the street, by a railway conductor, a taxi driver, a savings bank teller, the manager of a movie theater. Any one of them can arrest you, and you notice the concealed maroon color identification card only when it is too late. Sometimes arrest can even seem to be a game. There's so much superfluous imagination, so much well-fed energy invested in them. After all, the victim would not resist anyway. It is that the security agents want to justify their employment and the numbers. After all, it would seem enough to send notices to all the rabbits marked for arrest, and they would show up obediently at the designated hour, minute at the iron gates of state security with a bundle in their hand, ready to occupy a piece of floor in the cell which they were intended. And in fact, that's the way collective farmers are arrested. Who wants to go all the way into a hut at night with no roads to travel? Or they are summoned to the village and arrested there. Manual workers are called into the office. Of course, every machine has a point at which it is overlooked, beyond which it cannot function. In the strained and overloaded years of 1945 to 1946, when trainload after trainload poured in from Europe to be swallowed up immediately and sent to the Gulag, all that excessive theatrically went out the window, and the whole theory suffered greatly. All the fuss of the feathers of the ritual went flying in every direction, and the arrest of 10,000s took on the appearance of squalid roll call. They stood there with lists, read off the names, those one-on-one train loaded them onto another, and that was the whole arrest. For several decades, political arrests were distinguished in our country precisely by the fact that people were arrested who were guilty of nothing and were therefore unprepared to put up any resistance. There was a general feeling of being destined for destruction, a sense of having nowhere to escape from the GPU and KVD, which incidentally, given our internal passport system, was accurate. And even in the fever of epidemic arrest, when people leaving for work said farewell to their families every day because they could not leave a certain, they would return at night. Even then, almost no one tried to run away, and only in rare cases did people commit suicide. And that was exactly what was required. A submissive sheep is a find for a wolf. The submissiveness was also due to ignorance of the mechanics of the epidemic's arrest. By and large, the organs had no profound reasons for their choice of whom to arrest and whom not to arrest. They merely quotas might be filled on orderly basis or wholly arbitrarily. In 1937, a woman came to the reception of the room of Novocherkassk NKVD to ask what he should do about the unfed, unweaned infant. A neighbor asked what she should do about the unfed, unweaned infant of a neighbor who had been arrested. They said, "Sit down, we'll find out." She sat there for 2 hours, whereupon they took her and tossed her into the cell. They had a total plan which had to be fulfilled in a hurry, and there was no one available to send out in the city, and here was this woman already in their hands. Universal innocence also may give rise to the universal failure to act. Maybe they won't take you. Maybe it will all blow over. A.I. Ladizenki, after the chief teacher in school and remote Kologrov, 1937, a peasant approached him in an open market and passed him a message from the third person, Aleksandr Ivanich. "Get out of town, you are on the list." But he stayed. After all, the whole school rests on my shoulder, and their own children are pupils here. How can they arrest me? Several days later, he was arrested. Not everyone was so fortunate as to understand at the age of 14, as Vanya Levitsky, every honest man is sure to go to prison. Right now, my papa is serving time, and when I grow up, they'll put me in too. They put him in when he was 23 years old. The majority sit quietly and dare to hope. Since you are guilty, then how can they arrest you? It's a mistake. They are already dragging you along by the collar, and you will still be exclaiming to myself, "Oh, it's a mistake! It's a mistake! Now see things straight. Let me out." Other things are being arrested en masse, and that's a bothersome fact. But in those other cases, there's always some dark area, some fact. But in those other cases, there are also some dark area. Maybe he was guilty. But as for you, you are obviously innocent. You still believe in that the organs are humanly, logically institutions. They will set things straight for you. Why then should you run away? How can you resist right then? After all, you'll only make your situation worse. You'll make it more difficult for them to sort out the mistake, and it's just that you don't put up any resistance. You don't even walk down the stairs. You tiptoe, as you were ordered to do so your neighbors won't hear. At what exact point then what should one resist? When one's belt is taken away, when one's ordered to face into a corner, when one crosses the threshold of one's home. An arrest consists of a series of incidental irrelevancies and multitudinal things that do not matter, and there seems no point in arguing about any of them, one of them individually, especially at a time when the thoughts of the person arrested wrap tightly about the big question, what for? And yet all of those incidental irrelevancies taken together implacably constitute the arrest. Almost anything can occupy the thoughts of a person who has just been arrested. This alone would fill volumes. There can be feelings which we never expected. When 19-year-old Yevgenia Doyarenko, arrested in 1901, the three young Czechs were poked about in bed, and though they were in underwear in her chest and drawers, she was not disturbed. There was nothing, and there would find nothing, but all of a sudden they touched her personal diary, in which she would not have shown even to her own mother, and these hostile young strangers reading the words that she had written was more devastating to her than the whole Lubyanka with its bars and its cellar. It is true of many that the outrage inflicted by arrests of personal feelings and attachment can be far, far stronger than their political beliefs or their fear of prison. A person who is not inwardly prepared for the use of violence against him is always weaker than the person committing violence. There are few bright and daring individuals who understand instantly. Grigoriev, the director of the Geological Institute of Academy of Sciences, barricaded himself inside and spent 2 hours burning up his papers when they came to arrest him in 1948. Sometimes the principal emotion of the person arrested is relief and happiness. This is another aspect of human nature. It happened before the revolutions too. The Yekaterinodar school teacher, Serdyakova, involved in the Aleksandr Ulyanov, felt only relief when she was arrested. But this feeling was 1,000 times stronger during epidemics of arrest when all around you they were hauling in the people like you yourself and still had not come for you some reason, and they were taking their time. After all, that kind of exhaustion, that kind of suffering is worse than any kind of arrest, not only for a person of limited courage, Vasily Vlasov, a fearless communist whom we shall recall more than once later on, renounced the idea of escape, proposed by his non-party assistant and pined away because the entire leadership of the Cadi district was arrested in 1937, and they kept delaying and delaying his own arrest. He could only endure the blow head on. He did endure it, and then he relaxed, and during the first days after his arrest, he felt marvelous. In 1934, the priest Father Irakli went to Alma Ata to visit some believers in exile there. During his absence, they came 3 times to Moscow apartment to arrest him. When he was returned, members of the flock met him at the station and refused to let him go home, and for 8 years hid him in one apartment after another. The priest suffered so painfully from the harried life that when he was finally arrested in 1942, he sang hymns to praise the God. Resistance. Why didn't you resistance? Today, those who have been continue to live on in comfort skulls. Those who suffered, yes, resistance should have been begun right there at that moment of the arrest itself, but it did not begin. And so they are leading you. During a daylight arrest, there's always the brief and unique moment when they are leading you, either inconspicuously on the basis of a cowardly deal you have made, or else quietly, quite open, their pistols unholstered through a crowd of 100 just such doomed innocent as yourself. You aren't gagged. You really can, and you really ought to cry out that you are being arrested. That villain in the disguise that trapped people. That arrests are being made on the strength of the false documentation. That millions are being subjected to silent reprisals. If many should outcry, such had been heard all over the city in the course of the day, we would not be our fellow citizens. Perhaps we have begun to bristle and would arrest people perhaps no longer have been so easy. In 1927, when submissiveness had not yet softened our brains to such a degree, two Czechs tried to arrest a woman in Serpkov Square during the day. She grabbed a hold of the stanchion of a street lamp and began to scream, refusing to submit as crowd gathered. There had to have been that kind of woman. There had to have been that kind of crowd. Passerbys didn't all just close their eyes and hurry by. The quick young men immediately became flustered. They can't work in the public eye. They got into their car and fled. Right then and there, she would have gone to a railway station and left. But she went home, spent the night, and during the night, they took her off to Lubyanka. Instead, not one sound comes from your parched lips, and the passing crowd naively believes that you and your executioners are friends out for a stroll. I myself often had the chance to cry out on the 11th day after my arrest, 3 smashed bums, more burden and 4 suitcases full of war booty than by me. They had come to rely on me in the course of the long trip, bought me the Belarusian station in Moscow. They were called a special convoy, in other words, a special escort guard. But in actual fact, their automatic pistols only interfered with their dragging along that 4 terrible heavy bags of loot that their chefs in Smersh counterintelligence on the Second Belarusian front had plundered in Germany, and were now bringing to their families in the fatherland under the pretext of convoying me. I myself, like a 5th suitcase, with no great joy, since it contained my diaries, literary works, which never were being used as evidence against me. Not one of these 3 knew the city, and it was up to me to pick the shortest route to the prison. I had personally to conduct them to Lubyanka, where they had never been before, and which in fact I confused with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I spent 1 day in the counterintelligence prison at Army headquarters, 3 days in the counterintelligence prison at headquarters at the front, where cellmates had educated me in the deceptions practice and the interrogators, their threats and beatings. In fact, that once a person was arrested, he was never released, and the inevitability of a 10 or a 10-year sentence, and then the miracle I had suddenly burst out of there. And for 4 days, I traveled like a free among free people, even though my flanks had already lain on rotten straws beside me on the latrine buckets. My eyes had already been beaten up, and sleepless men. My ears had heard the truth, and my mouth had tasted prison gruel. So why did I keep silent? Why in my last minute out in the open did I not attempt to enlighten the hoodwinked crowd? I kept silent too. In the Polish city of Brodnica, but maybe didn't understand Russian there. I didn't call out one word. On the streets of Bialystok, but maybe I was in a matter that concerned the Poles. I didn't utter a sound at the Volkovysk station, but there were very few people there. I walked along the Minsk station platform behind the same bandits as if nothing at all were amiss. But the station was still a ruin, and now I was leading the Smersh men through a circular upper concourse of the Belarusian radial subway station on the Moscow Circle line, with its white collar ceiling dome, and brilliant electrical lights, and opposite us, 2 parallel escalators thing packed with Muscovites rising from the below. It seemed as though they were all looking at me. They kept coming in, endless ribbon, from down there, from a depth of ignorance. On and on me, beneath the gleaming dome, reached toward me for at least one word of truth. So why did I keep silent? Every man always had his handy, doesn't give a little reason why he is right not to sacrifice himself. Every man always has a handy, doesn't give little reason why right not to sacrifice himself. Some still have hopes of favourable outcomes to their case and are new afraid to run their chances by an outcry. For after all, we got no news from that other world, and we do not realise that from the very moment of arrest, our fate had almost certainly been decided in the worst possible sense, and that we cannot make it any worse. Others have not attained the mature concepts on which a shout of protest to the crowd must be based. Indeed, only a revolutionary has slogans on his lips that are crying to be uttered aloud. And where would the uninvolved, peaceable average man come from such slogans? He simply does not know what to shout. He then, last of all, there is a person whose heart is too full of emotion, whose eyes have seen too much, for the whole ocean to pour forth in a few disconnected cries. As for me, I kept silent for one further reason, because those Muscovites thrown in the steps of the escalator were too few for me, too few. Here my cry would be heard by 200 or twice 200, but about the 200, vaguely unclear. I had a vision that someday I would cry out to the 200 million. But for me, the time being, I did not open my mouth, and the escalator dragged me impeccably down into the netherworld. And when I got to O'Cockney Ryad, I continued to keep silent, nor did I utter a cry at Metropole Hotel, nor wave my arms on the Golgotha Lubyanka Square. One was probably the easiest imaginable kind of arrest, and it did not tear me up from the embrace of kith and kin, nor wrench me from a deeply cherished home life. One pallid European February, it took me from a narrow salient on the Baltic Sea, where, depending on one's point of view, either we had surrounded the Germans or they had surrounded us, and it deprived me only from one familiar artillery battery and the scenes of the last 3 months of the war. The brigade commander called me to his headquarters and asked for my pistol. I turned it over without suspecting any evil intent, and suddenly, from a tensely mobile suite of staff officers in the corner, 2 counterintelligence officers stepped forward hurriedly across the room. In a few quick bows, their 4 hands grabbed me simultaneously at the star on my cap, my shoulder boards, my officer's belt, my map case. Then they shouted theatrically, "You are under arrest!" burning and prickling from my head to toe. All I could exclaim was, "Me? What for?" And even though there is usually no answer to this question, surprisingly, I did receive one. This is worth regaling because it is so contrary to our usual setup. Across the sheer Solzhenitsyn, a gap created by a heavy-filling word, arrest across our quarantine line, and not even sound dared penetrate, came the unthinkable magic words of the brigade commander, "Solzhenitsyn, back here." With a sharp turn, I broke away from the hands of the smashed men and stepped back into the brigade commander's office. I had never known him very well. He had never condescended to run-of-the-mill conversations with me. To me, his face had always conveyed an order, a command, a wrath. But right now, he was illuminated in a thoughtful way Was it from shame for his own involuntary part in this dirty, dirty business? Was it from an impulsive to rise above pitiful subordination of a whole lifetime? 10 days before, I had led my own reconnaissance battery almost intact out of the fire pocket in which 12 heavy guns of his artillery battery had been left, and now he had to renounce me because of a piece of paper with a seal on it. You have, he asked weightily, a friend in the Ukrainian front? It's forbidden. You have no right. The captain and the major of the counterintelligence shouted at the colonel, but I had already stood. I knew instantly I had been arrested because of the correspondence with a school friend and understood from what direction to expect danger. Zakar Georgievich Travkin could have stopped right there, but no, continuing his attempt to expunge the part in this and to stand erect before his own conscience. He rose from behind his desk. He had never stood up in my personal presence in my former life. He reached across the quarantine line that separated us and gave me his hand, although he would never have reached out his hand to me had I remained a free man, and pressing my hand while his whole suit stood there in mute horror, showing that warmth that may appear in an habitually severe farce, he said fearlessly and precisely, I wish you happiness, Captain. Not only was I no longer a captain, but I had been exposed to the enemy of the people, for among us every person is totally exposed to the moments of their arrest, and he had wished happiness to an enemy. This is not going to be a volume of memoirs about my own life. Therefore, I am not going to recount the truly amusing details of my arrest, which was like no other. That night, Schmerz officers gave up their last hope of being able to make out where we were on the map. They never had been able to read maps anyway, so they politely handed the map to me, asked me to tell me where to drive or how to proceed to counterintelligence and army headquarters. I therefore led them myself to the prison at AHQ. I therefore led them myself to the prison, and in gratitude, they immediately put me not in an ordinary cell, but in a punishment cell. And I really must describe that closet in a German peasant house which served as a temporary punishment cell. It was the length of one human body and wide enough for three to lie, packed tightly four at a pinch. As it happened, I was the fourth, shoved in on the midnight. The three lying there blinked sleepily at me in the light of the smoky kerosene lantern and moved over, giving me enough space to lie on one side, half between them, half on top of them, until gradually by sheer weight I could wedge myself in, and so four overcoats lay on the crushed straw covered floor with 8 boots pointing at the door. They slapped and I burned. The more self-assured I had been as a captain half a day before, the more painful it was crowded into the floor of the class closet. Once or twice, the other fellows woke up numb on one side, and we all turned around at the same time. Toward morning, they woke, yawned, grunted, pulled up their legs, moved into various corners, and then acquaintances began. What are you in for? But a troubled little breeze of caution had already breathed on me beneath the poisoned roof of the Schmerz and pretended to be surprised. I had no idea. Did the bastards tell you? However, my cellmate tankmen in soft black helmets hid nothing. They were 3 honest, open-hearted soldiers, people of a kind of had become attached to during the war years, because I myself was more complex and worse. All 3 had been officers. Their shoulder boards also had been viciously torn off, and in some places the cotton batting stuck out, and on their strain-filled shirts like patches indicated where decorations had been removed, and there were dark and red scars, their faces and army, the results of wounds and burns. Their tank unit had unfortunately arrived for the repairs of the village where the Schmerz counterintelligence headquarters of the 48th Army was located, still damp from the battle of the day before yesterday. They had gotten drunk and on the outskirts of the village broken into a bath where they had noticed 2 raunchy broads going to bathe. The girls, half dressed, managed to get away all right from the soldiers' staggered, drunken leg, but one of them, it turns out, was from the property of the army chief of counterintelligence, no less. Yep, for 3 weeks of the war had been going on inside Germany, and all of us knew very well that if the girls were German, they could be raped and then shot. This was almost a combat distinction. Had they been Polish girls or our own displaced Russian girls, they could have been chased naked around a garden and slapped on the butt for amusement, but no more. But just because this one was camping wife of the chief counterintelligence right off deep in the rear, sergeants had viciously torn from their 3 frontline officers the shoulder boards awarded them by the front headquarters and had taken the decorations conferred upon them by the president of the Supreme Soviet, and now these warriors who had gone through the whole war and who had no doubt crushed more than one line of enemy trenches were waiting for a court-martial whose members, had it not been for their tank, could have come from anywhere in the village. We put on the kerosene lamp, which had already used up all the air there was to breathe. A Judas hole the size of a postage stamp had been cut in the door, and through this it came directly light from the corridor. Then, as if already that with the coming of daylight we would have too much room in the punishment cell, they tossed in a 5th person. He stepped in wearing a newish red army tunic in